Purport. Sarvarhanam Achyutejya. If Achyuta, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is worshipped, then everyone is worshipped. As stated in Srimad Bhagavatam 4:31-14, Yatha taror mula nisechanena tripyanti tat skandha bhujo pashakaha prano paharach chayethendriyanam tatheva sarvarhanam achyutejya. As pouring water on the root of a tree nourishes the trunk, branches, twigs, and leaves, and as supplying food to the stomach enlivens the senses and limbs of the body, worshiping the Supreme Personality of Godhead satisfies the demigods who are part of that Supreme Personality. Performing yajna involves worshiping the Supreme Lord. Here, the Supreme Lord worshipped the Supreme Lord. Therefore, it is said, Bhagavan Atmanatmanam, e.j. The Lord worshipped himself by himself. This does not, of course, justify the Mayavad philosophy by which one thinks himself the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The jiva, the living entity, is always different from the Supreme Lord. The living entities, vibhinangsha, never become one with the Lord, although Mayavadis sometimes imitate the Lord's worship of himself. Lord Krishna meditated upon himself every morning as a grihastha, and similarly, Lord Ramachandra performed yajnas to satisfy himself, but this does not mean that an ordinary living being should imitate the Lord by accepting the process of ahangrahopasana. Such unauthorized worship is not recommended herein. I'll read a translation of the verse again. Shukadev Goswami said, thereafter the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Lord Ramachandra, accepted an acharya and performed sacrifices, yajna, with opulent paraphernalia. Thus he himself worshipped himself, for he is the Supreme Lord of all demigods. Om Agyantimirandhasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurum Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sakrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvetam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitangscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Brindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Pancha Kalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhaktavrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Prasaya Bhutale Shrimati Radhanath Swami Nitya Namine. Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Prasaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Nitya Namine. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gaurvani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschat Deshtarine. So this morning we're reading, we're actually beginning a new chapter in this canto. And this chapter especially discusses Lord Ramachandra's Leela, his pastimes, after he and Sita Devi and Lakshman and the entire entourage have returned to Ayodhya. And Lord Ramachandra has been very joyously reinstated to the throne. And so we'll learn about, in this chapter, Lord Ramachandra's later pastimes. And it's very significant that the chapter begins, this verse that we're looking at this morning, begins with an opportunity to see Lord Ramachandra perform his daily responsibility, his what he is engaged in now that he is home in his kingdom. Lord Ramachandra is sometimes called Maryada Purushottama. Some of you may be familiar with this term. And this is a term that glorifies Lord Ramachandra as that particular manifestation or incarnation of the Lord who is especially teaching us through his example. Maryada, it's translated in different ways. Sometimes it's translated as etiquette, sometimes as kind of like boundaries and perimeters, sometimes more generally as the proper way of living. And so as Maryada Purushottama, Lord Ramachandra is the perfect supreme personality who teaches by his own example that proper way of living, that dharmic way of living. He's the embodiment of dharma. What does it mean to be a dharmic person? What does it mean to perform one's responsibilities? What does it mean to live a life of integrity, to live a life of righteousness? This is what Lord Ramachandra shows. Of course, we can't always imitate Lord Ramachandra, but we see his example. Here he's setting a very important example for us of what it means to live a life of dharma, to live a life of integrity. Excuse me. A couple of months ago, I heard a really wonderful story from His Holiness Varshana Swami. Varshana Maharaj was explaining, or he was recounting that Srila Prabhupada, on his last visit to New Vrindavan in 1976, had a darshan with some of the devotees that were living there, particularly the devotees that were kind of active in farming and in animal care, which is what Varshana Maharaj, I believe, was doing at the time. So he was part of this darshan. And in that darshan, some of these devotees, they mentioned that they were reaching out to some of the farms in the area, and they were interested in preaching to these neighboring farms, to sharing with these neighboring farms some teaching of bhakti. And Srila Prabhupada asked these devotees, he became really kind of interested, and he said, what will you speak to these devotees, to these farmers? How will you preach to these farmers? So some of you may know this story. So one devotee spoke up and he said, well, Srila Prabhupada will explain to them that the Bhagavad Gita, and before this devotee even finished, Srila Prabhupada come off. And he said, no, Gita. So the devotee was a little taken aback. Okay, how to preach without bringing in the Gita. So then another devotee spoke up, maybe thinking that the first devotee, okay, maybe instead of the Gita, we should go to another text. So the second devotee said, well, Srila Prabhupada, we can tell them that the Srimad Bhagavatam says, and Prabhupada again cut him off. He said, don't bring in the Bhagavatam. Some of the devotees were really taken aback. Then a brave third devotee spoke up. And he said, well, Srila Prabhupada will say, Lord Krishna, and before he could even finish, Srila Prabhupada again cut him off and said, don't bring in Krishna. So now the devotees were really bewildered, right? How can you even, how to preach without even bringing up Krishna? So what can we possibly say? So the devotees kind of, sort of gave up and were silent for a little while. And then Srila Prabhupada said, I'll tell you what to say. He said, you tell these farmers that every morning the sun rises and the sun gives energy and warmth and heat, and the rain falls and the rain gives nourishment, and the soil is there and it's providing so many nutrients, so many wonderful ingredients for life. And so in this way, we're being blessed by the sun, by the rain, by the earth, by so many things. So we should be grateful. So Srila Prabhupada said, you should tell these farmers, simply be grateful. Of course, Prabhupada spoke in different ways at different times, but it's a really powerful instruction, and it stayed with Varshana Swami for so many years, that what is the power of simply being grateful? In one sense, there's no question of any kind of spirituality, any kind of theology, any kind of connection to something beyond ourselves if we're not able to tap into gratitude. How powerful is gratitude? One philosopher, I'm forgetting the name, but one Western philosopher said that gratitude is not simply one of the virtues, but gratitude is in fact the key that unlocks all of the virtues. That if we can just develop gratitude, every other virtuous quality emerges from that. That gratitude in so many ways is like the foundation. And we see this in Vedic culture as well, that the basis of what it means of maryada, of what it means to be a dharmic person, in so many ways is gratitude, that we're the recipient of so many gifts. And so we have to acknowledge that. Not just acknowledge it, but while we could never repay it, we, through our actions, express that gratitude. Right? We if you look at Vedic culture broadly, what is prescribed, all these pujas, worship, all these yagyas, sacrifice, it's there in one sense to help us to reciprocate with the gifts that we're receiving. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that one who doesn't perform sacrifice is like a thief, because they're just taking without giving anything back, without even acknowledging the gift. So this is such a foundational piece of what it means, and this is so much the foundation of what it means to live a life of integrity, to live a life of dharma. Is to be grateful and to express that gratitude. And so there are these systems of yajna, of puja, to acknowledge the various gifts that we receive, that we're receiving gifts from nature, we're receiving gifts from our ancestors and forefathers and foremothers, that we're receiving gifts from the celestial beings, from greater powers, from gods and goddesses, demigods, devata. So there's these different kinds of ways of expressing that gratitude that are prescribed, that are recommended. Right? Pitri puja, devata puja, bhumi puja, to acknowledge the earth, to acknowledge the gods and goddesses, the celestial powers, to acknowledge our ancestors, and ultimately to acknowledge the Supreme Lord, to acknowledge the source of all of these, and the source of ourselves. So the more we're growing in our capacity to understand what it means to lead a dharmic life, the more we should be feeling this gratitude and should be eager to express this gratitude. But then the question arises, how do we express this gratitude? How do we possibly acknowledge and reciprocate with all the gifts that we're receiving in all these different ways? In this verse that Srila Prabhupada cites in the purport, the Bhagavatam offers us a very powerful, very radical approach to how we show our gratitude to everyone, how we reciprocate with all of the gifts that we receive. The Bhagavatam in this verse in the fourth chapter, in the fourth canto, encourages us to worship Achyuta, the infallible Lord, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who the verse very poetically and beautifully compares to the root of a tree. This is one of the most powerful analogies that we find in the Bhagavatam and in the Bhakti tradition. My own spiritual teacher, His Holiness Radhanath Swami, will very often quote or cite this analogy. And I've heard him express that in some ways, if we really understand this analogy, if we try to dive deeply into this analogy, we can understand it encapsulates bhakti itself. This is a perfect way of summing up what it means to practice bhakti. To get to the root, to express our love and our gratitude to Krishna, and by doing that, our love and our gratitude is expressed to everyone. It's beautiful. It's one of my favorite pieces of writing from Srila Prabhupada. It actually is in the preface or the introduction to Nectar, which is Srila study of Rupa Swami. So okay, preface and introductions. Important, but just by reading, I think it was maybe even published as a separate small book, but just by reading these introductory material of the Nectar of Devotion, it's so many really wonderful statements are there. And one in particular really strikes me, again, in the similar spirit, where Srila Prabhupada talks about how our natural state is, our natural propensity is to love without limit. It's who we are as part and parcel of Krishna, as spirit souls. We are, the Jiva Atma has this natural inclination, this natural propensity to love. And not just to love, but to love without limit, to love unconditionally, to love unceasingly, to love uninterruptedly. Ahaitiki apratihata, the Bhagavatam says. This is the only thing that truly satisfies us, yayatma suprasidati. And this is the thing that we are, in one sense, made for. It's hardwired into us. It's our very nature. And Srila Prabhupada explains in this preface that although it is our nature, we're constantly being frustrated in this world, because although we want to love without limit, we're not able to do it here. And so we're constantly frustrated. So how, Srila Prabhupada asks rhetorically, how can we find a way to express this limitless love that is our natural inclination? And then Prabhupada gives the answer very much as he does in this purport, by saying when we can direct our love, when we can repose, he says in this very beautiful kind of old world British English, when we can repose our love in Krishna, then we love Krishna, and by extension, we love everyone and everything, then our love is able to flow, to shine forth without any interruption, without any limit, just like a beam of light that's able to constantly expand and yet shine infinitely without limit. So this is the art of doing it. And in this analogy, this powerful analogy of watering the root of a tree, really speaks to this. So I wanted to just take a little bit of time to unpack this analogy a little bit, so we can perhaps remind ourselves and better appreciate what's going on when we talk about reposing our love in Krishna, reposing our gratitude by directing it towards Krishna, and how that truly is expressing our gratitude and our love for everyone and everything. Let's imagine that we are tasked with caring for a plant. Maybe we can, like, this analogy sometimes refers to it as a tree. Maybe there's like a little sapling of a tree. And we can imagine perhaps that even a small sapling, it's for this plant. So how do we do it? We want to make sure that the trunk is healthy. We want to make sure that the branches, the twigs, the leaves, flowers or fruits that emerge from, right, these blossoms, we want to care for all of these aspects. We don't want to leave anything out. So now imagine we try an approach where we say, well, I'm going to care for every single part of this tree. I'm going to care for every branch, for every twig, for every leaf. And maybe we gather up some tools, and we get little eyedroppers that we can use to sprinkle some water or some nourishing, plant food. I'm seeing a note in the chat box that the connection seems to be breaking up, and I don't know if that. Okay, it's not. It doesn't seem like it's breaking up for me, so I'm not sure. But I apologize if that's happening for others. Yes, it looks like it is happening. Maybe I can turn off my video, and hopefully that the audio will be clear, and maybe you can let me know in the chat box. And if not, then perhaps we'll have to try something else. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just turn off my video in the meantime. So I apologize, especially for those who are watching along on YouTube. Okay, hopefully this helps. So again, let's imagine in our version of this analogy that we want to care for every aspect of this tree or this plant. We don't want to leave anything out. So we get all the tools that we need to zero in on every aspect of this plant or this tree, and we want to care for it. And that sounds like a really great plan. It sounds like actually our intentions are really good. It's actually quite a beautiful thing to want to be so inclusive, to want to be so holistic and caring, but we're going to run into some problems. And so hopefully some folks are able to interact a little bit in the chat box. But what are some of the problems? You can just put it into the chat box rather than unmute. But what are some of the problems that we might run into if we try this approach of just caring for every aspect of the plant or the tree separately? So one problem, and thank you, Rukmini. Yeah, great. So the responses are coming in. So let's take them one by one. So one problem that Jamuna Jaya and Athena are both kind of getting at is it's going to be pretty exhausting. It's going to take a lot of our energy. It's going to take a lot of our time, right? It's going to feel pretty overwhelming. It's going to require a lot. And the danger, of course, there are lots of things that require a lot of time and energy, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Some things really deserve our time and energy. But the danger, and Jamuna Jaya is pointing this out, the danger is also fatigue, right? It's a recipe for being burnt out. It's so consuming, what to speak of caring for, like, let's say, multiple plants, multiple trees. It's so consuming, it's so overwhelming that the danger is, or one danger is, that we can get burnt out, we can get exhausted, we can get tired, we can get desensitized. And some of us have experience with this kind of thing, especially if you have any experience of having to kind of run around and trying to please multiple people and at once. It's really, really kind of difficult. And more than difficult, it's really kind of draining in a way. So much energy and work, it's fatigue. Let's say somehow or other we were even able to deal with that. Rukmini and others are pointing out that there's still a danger, and the danger is we might, even with our best efforts, our best intentions, we might still care for only part of that tree or plant, and we may inadvertently neglect another. And then with all of our good intention, it's like, it's so disappointing, right? We've tried so hard and yet still we've neglected, or we may be unbalanced, right? It may be very difficult. It's how to achieve that perfect balance where we're caring for all aspects of the tree or the plant. Do we sort of approach it mathematically and spend exactly whatever it is, 5% on each part, and then we add it all up until we get to 100? Well, that's really difficult to do, and that may not even be what the plant needs, right? Certain aspects of the plant or the tree are going to require more attention than others, or different kinds of attention. So one of the dangers, in addition to just being overwhelmed and exhausted and possibly burning out, is that we may inadvertently give more attention to one aspect than another. So how to know how much attention to give, where we're being neglectful, where we're being attentive enough, under attentive, over attentive, right? That's really difficult to figure out. Of course, there is a much deeper problem, and I'm sorry, I don't know who this is because it's just showing up as iPhone. But one of the assembled devotees has written it in the chat box there. The only way to really care for it is through the root. In other words, by design, nature designed in a certain way. Is don't Haribol, can you hear me? If you can hear me, please.
Yes, yay.
Okay, I'm so sorry. You know what? I think the problem may be on my end. Believe it or not, we had a tornado here yesterday, a small tornado, and it may have just done something to the internet connection here. So I thought I was good, and it seems like I'm back on now. But um, so shall we just kind of continue or wrap up? Is that okay? I don't know.
Please continue.
Okay. Um, so anyway, I know we're coming up at time, but just to kind of really really try to grasp what's going on with this analogy. Right, we were talking about all of the limitations that come with trying to address these various aspects of the different parts of the plant or the tree without approaching the root. And the biggest reason to go to the root is that is nature's arrangement for how to nourish the plant on the deepest level, on the truest, most sustainable, sustained level. We can address the leaves and the twigs and the branches and the trunk separately. But even then, even if we were able somehow to not get burnt out and not get exhausted, and even if we were to somehow perfectly attend to every single branch and twig without missing a single one, still our care and our nourishment would only go so far, because it's again, and I'm not an expert here, but from what I understand, just on a very kind of simple level, it is through the nourishment being channeled through the roots that that nourishment is able to really reach exactly where it needs to go. So much so that the Bhagavatam actually offers another analogy in the same passage, that just as the roots nourish the tree in the same way, by feeding the stomach, the body, the limbs of the body are nourished, right? We don't have to separately nourish each limb. That doesn't mean we neglect each limb. That doesn't mean if there's an opportunity to take care of a particular part of the body that we're inattentive to it. But we understand that ultimately nourishment in a sustainable and sustained way has to go through the process of feeding the stomach, or in the case of the plant, has to go through watering the root. So when we speak about worshiping Krishna, and the reason I wanted to just kind of zero in on this and spend a little bit of time on this is sometimes, unfortunately, in our own immaturity, we can think about this idea of worshiping Krishna in terms of neglecting others. We don't, engage in demigod worship, Anya Devata Puja, so we just worship Krishna. So sometimes, even subtly, the focus of our mood can be in being dismissive of the other thing, right? We don't do this, we don't do that. There's no need to do that. That's not important. This is less than, right? And sometimes we even project, or we can project, if we're not careful, this kind of an egoistic mentality or mood. But that's not what's being suggested in this analogy. In fact, it's the exact opposite. We worship Krishna with the full faith and understanding, not that we're neglecting anyone or anything, not that we're disrespecting anyone else or anything, but that we want to direct our love towards the root, with this beautiful intention to send that love and that gratitude to everyone, and particularly to those to whom we feel this debt of gratitude, from whom we've received so many gifts. We want to make sure that we are honoring and reciprocating with those gifts, and expressing that gratitude in the deepest possible way. And so Lord Ramachandra in this verse is modeling for us how to do that by performing yajna directed towards the Supreme Lord, directed towards, in this verse, the Lord is referred to by this beautiful epithet of Sarva Deva Mayam Devam, the Supreme Lord who is Sarva Deva Mayam, who is the embodiment, the totality. Srila Prabhupada translates this interestingly, very poetically, as the heart and soul of Sarva Deva, of all the devatas, of all the gods and goddesses, of all the divinities, of everyone who blesses us and graces us. The Supreme Lord is the embodiment and the source of all of them. And so when we direct our love and our gratitude towards him, it's like watering that root. And we can trust that the water and the nourishment is going to every part of that tree or every part of that plant. That we're not neglecting, but rather we are seeking to honor in the deepest and most complete way everyone who we are receiving gifts from, who we are recipients, we are beneficiaries of. This is what Lord Ramachandra is modeling for us. Now, and there's more attention to the branches and the twigs and the leaves, right? When we say we nourish the root, that's a general principle, but that doesn't mean that in our own lives, there are not going to be opportunities to show some special care, some special attention. We can't use watering the root as an excuse to neglect or to assume that, yes, our intention is there to care for everyone, to express love and gratitude for everyone, but sometimes there are opportunities that are presented to especially acknowledge a gift that we've received. And we should take those opportunities, just as anyone who's cared for a plant knows, if you're caring for a plant, let's say you're caring for a tulsi plant, and you're watering her roots very diligently, but you notice that there are some leaves and twigs that seem to be in a precarious tradition or a condition that are calling out for some extra tender, loving care. We give that tender, loving care. We don't, it's not an either or. We don't confuse that or use that as, that doesn't mean that, oh, I was wrong about watering the roots. No, we continue to water the roots, but we can also give, using our discernment, some extra care and attention when it's needed and warranted. But that's situational, right? So there's watering the roots, which is our general sort of foundational engagement. So that's where our love is directed. Our primary engagement is to direct our love towards Krishna. And along with that, when there are opportunities to express our gratitude and love to particular devotees, to our families, to our forefathers, foremothers, those that came before us, our teachers, so many people that we're blessed with. And yes, even the devatas. You'll find, for instance, in Vrindavan, it's considered your pilgrimage to Vrindavan is incomplete without paying respects to Gopeshwar Mahadev, to Lord Shiva. You'll find the gopis perform worship of the goddess Durga, Katyayani. So the point is not to just denigrate the devatas or to say that there's never an opportunity to express our worship or our gratitude or our love towards them. There may be those opportunities, but those opportunities are all harmonized with the principle of watering the roots. And then the second sort of caveat with the watering the root analogy is, if we are watering the root, it should be manifesting in healthy leaves and twigs and branches, right? In other words, it should be showing up in every aspect of our life. If we're finding that in the name of performing bhakti and worshiping Krishna, we are every other relationship in our life and every other aspect of our life is in shambles. Of course, there are some extreme cases where sometimes Krishna, to teach us certain lessons or to draw us nearer to him, may arrange for things like that. But in general, if we are really watering the roots, we should be seeing that love, gratitude, healthy appreciation, relationships manifesting in other aspects of our life. And if it's not, it's an opportunity to really pause and introspect and question ourselves if we're actually watering the roots properly, or perhaps we need to fine tune what we're doing. Perhaps we think we're watering the roots, but actually we're missing those roots, or there's some other problem that we need to address. A final point, and I apologize again for all the technical mishaps, so we are going over time a little bit, but a final point that Srila Prabhupada really emphasizes in this purport is that we shouldn't misunderstand that what Lord Ramachandra is doing here, because he is the Supreme Lord himself and he's worshiping the Supreme Lord, we may erroneously conclude that what Lord Ramachandra is modeling for us is self-worship, is that we should direct our worship towards ourselves, just as he was directing his worship towards himself. There's a similar episode that Srila Prabhupada alludes to in the purport, where in the Krishna book, drawn from the 10th canto, where it's similarly described that Lord Krishna, when living in Dwarka, his daily practice was to begin each day by meditating on himself. And Srila Prabhupada also points out in the Krishna book, similarly, that we shouldn't mistakenly conclude that therefore we should worship ourselves or meditate on ourselves, or it's all about ourselves, but rather that the Lord is modeling something for us. And because he's a Supreme Lord, of course, he's meditating on himself. But for us, the lesson is for us to meditate on the Supreme Lord. And it's a little bit of a tricky point. And this is a bit of a rough analogy, but the analogy that came to my mind was, sometimes a teacher to instruct the student may kind of take on the task of the student themselves. So I remember when I was in first grade, especially when children are very young, you see this, when I was like in kindergarten or first grade, maybe around Thanksgiving or something like this, but there was a lesson on gratitude, on thankfulness, speaking of gratitude. And our teacher had us write letters to her, to the teacher, expressing, what we were thankful for, thanking our teacher. And because we were very young, we were very small, so we didn't really even know, some of us maybe at that age, some kids know how to read and write, some don't, we're all kind of like learning. So the teacher, what she did was on the blackboard, she wrote out like a sample letter. And to teach us how to write, she addressed the letter to herself, right? So my first grade teacher's name was Mrs. Rogan. So she wrote on the board, "Dear Mrs. Rogan," next line, "Thank you for being my teacher," like that, right? A couple of sentences maybe. Now, if someone were to walk into that classroom, they might think, well, oh, so this teacher is teaching that we should write letters to ourselves. But that wasn't the lesson. The lesson was to write the letter to the teacher, but because the teacher could see that we needed that extra help, we needed that guidance, that on our own, we wouldn't be able to formulate the words or know how to put it together. So in her sort of kindness and graciousness and compassion, she wrote it out for us so we could learn how to copy word for word or sentence for sentence. But again, the lesson is not that therefore we should write letters to ourselves. The lesson was how to write the letter to the teacher. So in a similar way, it's a little bit of a rough analogy, but in a similar way, when Lord Ramachandra is performing worship to himself, or when Lord Krishna is meditating on himself, the lesson for us is how we can also meditate on or worship the Supreme Lord. He's setting the example. Yeah, as Jamuna Jaya is pointing out in the chat box, what the great people do, what great men and women people do, others will follow. So they're setting the example. But again, we have to have that wisdom or that discernment to understand what the lesson is there. And the lesson here is, again, when we perform yajna, like some of you may know, you may have participated in a fire sacrifice for like an initiation or a wedding or something like that. In a yajna, even in the ritual sense, we make an offering and we chant a very simple mantra, or there's a very simple, succinct phrase when we're performing, when we're offering the oblation into the fire. We say something like idam krishnaya idam namama, or idam vishnave idam namama. So what does that mean? That means literally this idam krishnaya, this is yours, Krishna, this belongs to you, Krishna. Idam namama, this is not mine, this doesn't belong to me. So that's what yajna is for Krishna, or for Vishnu, for the Supreme Lord. It's meant to be offered to him. And so what Lord Ramachandra is doing here in this unconventional way is he's reminding us of this principle. Idam Krishnaya idam namama. This, Krishna, my life, my activities, my thoughts, my words, my deeds, anything I claim to possess, all of this is yours. Let it be used in your service. Let it be for your glorification. Let it be, but this simple token offering I'm making, even in this yajna, just be an expression of my deep love and gratitude for you. Thank you so much. Again, apologies for going over time and for the technical glitches. As long as I have an internet connection and folks are able to stay, I'm happy to try to entertain some questions or comments. And thank you all for the encouraging words in the chat box. Are there any questions, or would anyone like to share any comments or realizations?
Just want to say thank you so much. I too am having technical difficulties, so I can't see you, but thank you so much. And I always love that you stated the nectar of devotion introduction. I love that phrase about where we have so much love, and he does use that phrase, where should we repose this love? Thank you for reminding us of it, because that is such a, I just feel so encouraged by that statement and so comforted by it. And so thank you so much for bringing that up.
Well, thank you. I'm glad it resonated. Okay, well, thank you all so much. So if there's nothing further, we can close here. And I wish you a wonderful rest of your day, filled with expressing love and gratitude and watering the root in whatever way you can. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Samved Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.